Welcome to the world of Dreamside Traveler. Here, beneath the soothing sound of gentle rain, we journey through time and space, uncovering the mysteries of the past and diving into the most captivating pages of human history. This place is created for those who love exploring the world in the quiet of evening, for those who value peace while yearning to discover something new before sleep. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please give this video a like. It helps other people find our stories. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers in our club of nighttime history lovers. And the Dreamside Traveler channel will become your faithful guide to sleep. We're constantly adding new stories for your peaceful evenings. And if you have ideas about which historical topics interest you, or simply want to share your thoughts, leave comments below the video. I'm genuinely curious to know what inspires you. Now close your eyes. Feel this gentle rain outside your window. Allow yourself to relax. Our journey begins right now. In the frost-bitten hills of Eldon Moor, where the wind howled like wolves and snow fell sideways more often than down, the people of Dunsmuir prepared for another merciless winter. Their village was little more than a scattering of wooden hovels with slanted roofs weighed down by snow and thatch. Smoke from tiny fires curled reluctantly from chimneys, only to vanish into the pale sky. Every breath you took turned to mist, and every step outside felt like a test of endurance from the gods. Old Tomil, the village cooper, was the first to rise before dawn. His back creaked worse than the timber planks beneath his feet. His one-room cottage was built by his grandfather, and the wind knew every crack, every forgotten seam in the wood and wattle. The walls were stuffed with sheep's wool and crumbling moss, but it made little difference. The cold slid in like a thief. Tomil wrapped himself in 3 tunics, 2 wool, 1 fur-trimmed, and added a fox-skin cap that flopped over his ears. The fire had died in the night, and frost had formed on the edge of his water bucket inside the house. He stomped to life, swinging his arms to feel some part of him warm again. Across the village, young Nara and her mother, Malda, shared a hut built partly into the hill for shelter. The floor was packed earth, now hard as stone. A single window, just a hole stuffed with rag and waxed hide, offered no sunlight, only a dim, bluish hue that spoke of more snow to come. Nara's nose peeked from under a deerskin blanket. She dared not move. Underneath, she wore all the clothes she owned. Movement meant breaking the seal of warmth her mother had carefully layered around them the night before. Not far away, Jorik the baker lit his oven. It was the warmest place in Dunsmuir for the briefest moment before the dough went in. Villagers came early to stand by the heat, pretending to buy bread, but really just hoping to thaw their fingers. Children cupped their hands over stones warmed in the oven and ran back home, tucking them into their bedding to fight off the night's chill. The bread itself, coarse rye with bits of barley, was less about taste and more about survival. In this bitter season, warmth was not a comfort but a luxury, earned, hunted, bartered, and hoarded like treasure. Firewood was scarce, and when it could be found, it was often damp, smoking more than burning. Even the wealthier families, those with 2-room homes and an actual hearth, struggled to keep the cold from crawling into their bones. And the poor, they learned to sleep close, 3 or 4 to a bed, sometimes with the family goat for extra heat. The stench was something they stopped noticing after the first freeze. When dusk came, the sky turned the color of bruised slate, and the silence grew heavy. The snow swallowed sound, and only the creaking timbers or the low groan of the wind through the hills dared break it. At night, villagers lay under matted wool, furs, and even sacks stitched together. If they were lucky, the fire would still hold a glow in the hearth by morning. But luck was rare in Eldon Moor, and still the villagers endured. They whispered stories of spring by candlelight, imagined green leaves and buzzing flies, and they carried hope like a second heart. Because that was what the cold could never take. Hope passed from breath to breath, generation to generation, like an ember waiting to be stoked again. The snow had not stopped for 5 days. It piled along the crooked paths of Dunsmuir like ancient tombs, swallowing carts, fences, and even the bottom halves of doors. The wind blew so fiercely that the drifts took on strange shapes, curving spines and sharp ridges like the backs of sleeping beasts. The village moved slower now, the cold having found its way into bones, not just boots. Inside a narrow, timber-framed house at the edge of the settlement, the Brothick family huddled in a shrinking circle of heat. Barrick, the father, had tried his best. He'd chopped every log he could find, even burning the wooden shelves from the old barn. But now all that remained were damp branches and a few broken fence posts. The hearth spat and hissed. The fire no longer blazed, it whimpered. His wife Len coughed into a cloth that came away red-flecked. Their youngest, little Wim, barely 4 winters old, curled near the hearthstone with a feverish flush on his cheeks. "Is it morning?" the child mumbled. "No, love," Len whispered, stroking his tangled hair. "It's only the fire talking." Barrick knew they wouldn't last another week like this. So he braved the storm. He took the sleigh, really just a bent door tied with rope, and trudged toward the woodland, a half-day's walk if the trail could be found. Most villagers feared the forest in winter. It was too quiet, too full of secrets. But desperation silenced superstition. Meanwhile, back in the village center, the blacksmith, Marta, was gathering scraps from her forge. Old horseshoes, metal filings, cracked anvils, anything she could melt or sell for wood. She didn't speak much, not since her brother froze last frost while returning from the river with an empty pail. But today, she opened her doors. Children with frostbitten toes were let in. Elderly neighbors wrapped in layers of sackcloth came and sat on the stone floor near her furnace. The place smelled of iron and sweat, but it was warm. For a time, the forge became a sanctuary, a cathedral of heat, where breath no longer turned to mist and hope could be shaped like molten steel. But even kindness had limits. Marta had barely enough coal for herself, and when she looked into the faces around her, thin cheeks, red eyes, trembling hands, she saw the fire within them already fading. Barrick returned 3 days later, dragging more than wood. He came with bruises on his arms and a stitched gash above one brow. But behind him followed old Nurek, the woodcrafter who'd vanished months ago. The two men had crossed paths in the forest, both scavenging for survival. Together, they'd taken down a half-dead stag trapped in ice. The meat and pelt were shared among 5 families. The bones were boiled for broth. For a brief time, the village breathed again. But the cold never left. At night, the wind still howled like a grieving mother, and snow crept through every crack. Each villager knew that if their fire failed, it would not be death that came first, but the silence. By the 3rd moon of winter, the village of Dunsmuir no longer whispered, it barely breathed. Doors remained shut. No laughter rang out. Even the crows, those clever foragers of the cold months, had abandoned the rooftops. It was as if the world had been muffled under a thick woolen shroud, and every soul trapped beneath it was waiting for something to change, or simply to end. Inside the Chessel household, the walls creaked with every gust of wind. Dama Chessel, a widow for 3 winters, sat curled beside her youngest daughter, Britha. Their small hearth emitted only the faintest glow, embers buried beneath ash. There was no more wood, no more fat to burn. The dried roots they had left were nearly gone, and Dama had begun soaking them in broth, just to soften the flavorless chew. Britha had stopped speaking. She used to sing when the sky turned pink, her voice threading through the rafters like sunlight through frost. Now she only stared at the ceiling, waiting. Dama didn't know whether for spring or for death. At the far end of the village, old Garrick, once a trapper, now nearly blind, stumbled through the snow with a sack slung over his shoulder. Inside were the bones of his dog, which had died quietly 2 nights ago beside the fire. Garrick hadn't the heart to eat him, but he couldn't bear the smell of rot either. So he trudged out to bury him beneath the elder tree, the same tree where his wife had once danced during midsummer. As Garrick worked, hands numb and bloodied from digging, he noticed something strange: footprints. Not his own, not barefoot like a beggar's either. These were booted and recent. He followed them. They led to the edge of the river, frozen but whispering. He crouched low, every bone protesting, and saw something extraordinary. A hole. A perfectly round hole carved through the ice with a set of unfamiliar tools. Nearby, wedged in the reeds, was a sealed pot. Inside, fish, 4 of them. Salted, fresh, and wrapped in birch bark. Whoever had left it behind was no common poacher. Back in Dunsmuir, word of the fish spread like wildfire. At first, it was dismissed as myth, the half-mad tales of an old man whose memories had become stitched together with dreams. But then more gifts began to appear. A pile of firewood near the chapel door, 3 apples on the doorstep of the weaver's hut, a needle and thread set, polished and bone-handled, left on the windowsill of the blind seamstress. No one saw the giver. No one heard footsteps. But the gifts came, silent and generous, as if the forest itself had grown compassionate. Some believed it was a ghost. Others, a forgotten god of the cold come to reward the pious. But Barrick suspected the truth. One night, under the veil of a moonless sky, he followed the footprints that reappeared after each gift. Through the crooked path behind the blacksmith's forge, down the slope past the frozen well, and into the ruins of the old tower where children once played. There, beside a crumbling stone wall, he found her. A girl thin as bark, wrapped in patchwork furs, with fingers like twigs and eyes that glinted like flint. "Why?" Barak whispered. She only smiled and held out a loaf of bread, warm, impossibly fresh. Then, like smoke, she was gone. By the fourth stretch of the cold season, Dunsmuir no longer feared death. It had learned to live alongside it. The dead were no longer buried, but laid upon great stones by the river's edge, where frost preserved them as silent witnesses to winter's rain. And yet, against all odds, the village endured. The girl, no one knew her name, became a myth woven into the everyday. Children whispered about the frost weaver, a spirit of ice who left gifts only for the deserving. The elders began to leave offerings in return. A carved toy, a braid of dried herbs, even a lullaby sung into the wind. These small tokens were hung on branches or tucked into the cracks of stone walls, vanishing by morning. Barak, however, knew she was no spirit. He had seen her eyes, human eyes full of watchfulness and loneliness. He told no one, not even Myra, though she asked him every night. Something in him needed to protect her, not just her secret, but her life. One night, Barak returned home to find Myra burning their last stool. She wept while it cracked and hissed in the fire. He wrapped her in his arms, and they shared the warmth of that final flame until the room went black. That night, he made a decision. He would find her again. It was not easy. The girl moved through the woods like wind. He left food near the ruins, hoping she would appear. Days passed. Then, one dawn, he found a message scratched into a plank, hidden beneath the bread he'd offered. "North Glade, 3 stones. Wait." So he waited. Snow fell in thick waves. Barak stood there for hours, his limbs stiff, his breath smoke. Just as he began to lose hope, she stepped from between 2 ancient trees. She looked older than he remembered, though perhaps it was the way she held herself, taller, wary. Her voice was softer than the snow itself. "Why do you follow me?" Barak hesitated. "You help us. I want to help you." The girl tilted her head. "No one helps me." He offered her a wool scarf, the last thing Myra owned from their mother. The girl didn't take it. Instead, she sat beside the 3 stones and began to speak, her words chiseled by silence and sorrow. Her name was Elen. She had come from beyond the ridge, from a village swallowed by snow. All had died, all but her. She learned to trap, to fish through ice, to hide from wolves and men alike. When she stumbled upon Dunsmuir, she meant only to pass through. But the way they suffered, without begging, without turning cruel, it moved her. "I thought I'd forgotten what kindness was," she said. Barak listened, truly listened. From then on, he met her at the 3 stones every second night. He brought what he could, old cheese, scraps of meat, even gossip. In return, she taught him how to make a snare, how to catch snow melt, how to find dry wood beneath the skin of dead trees. Together, they began to build something. With Elen's guidance, Barak dug a snow shelter behind the smithy where children could warm themselves. She showed Myra how to stitch moss into boots. She even left a single rabbit fur coat on Damaz's doorstep, with tiny stitches of birch thread that spelled, "Warmth is survival." Still, she never entered the village, not once. and Barak began to wonder, what was she really afraid of? As the frost began to loosen its grip on the northern edge of Elber Hollow, tiny signs of renewal flickered among the decay. Though the snow still clung to the shaded sides of the hill, the air smelled different, less of soot and sweat, and more of damp soil and distant blossoms yet to bloom. Inside their croft, nestled between the edge of the dark woods and the frozen marshes, little remained to burn. Etta's fingers were red and split, not from the cold, but from gathering bramble branches and scraping moss from the stone walls to make a kind of smoldering paste. It gave little heat, but reminded her of life. Dare, though barely 10, had stopped asking for meat weeks ago. He only asked when the ground would stop crunching beneath their feet. Bram, who had once been strong enough to break stone with a hammer, now limped when he walked. The cold had crept into his bones and made a home there, yet each morning, before the others stirred, he would take a small iron rod and prod the last night's ashes, coaxing them back to life. No fire ever flamed bright, but he made it glow just enough so his family would wake with hope, not frostbite. It was hope that drove them forward day by day. The kind that clung to small miracles, like a single surviving chicken egg found warm beneath feathers, or the return of a raven that had disappeared midwinter, now circling again above their roof. Bram called that bird a good omen. Etta called it foolish, but she still left breadcrumbs on the sill. One morning, the ice on the bucket outside was soft enough to break with a boot heel. A storm had rolled in days before, coating everything in silence, but now that hush was lifting. The river nearby cracked and groaned under the rising light, and for the first time in moons, they heard it move. Flowing, a sound like a giant stirring in its sleep. They walked to the edge of the marshes, where the thaw had begun, and saw a deer, thin, cautious, but alive, drinking from the brackish melt. Dare gasped, and Etta had to press a hand to his shoulder to keep him still. The animal raised its head, blinked, then vanished into the woods with elegant panic. But it didn't matter. The deer had come. The villagers, one by one, began to emerge like shoots from cracked earth. Faces pale and sunken, clothes in tatters, but spirits unbroken. They gathered around the commons and built a bonfire, not for warmth, but for the marking of survival. The youngest sang. The eldest wept. Bram stood beside Etta, her arm hooked through his, and whispered, "We made it, woman." "No," she answered softly. "We're making it." It would be weeks before the true thaw and months before the first crops. But spring had crossed the threshold, and so had they. And in that stubborn, fragile moment of breath and ash and earth, the hollow felt full of life again. In the remote village of Drindle Hollow, tucked between the jagged shale cliffs and windswept plains of the Eastmere, stood a cluster of huts that barely passed as homes. These were not the stone houses of nobles or merchants, nor the tidy wooden cottages of fabled tales. No, these were peasant shelters, assembled from desperation, and whatever nature begrudgingly provided. The home of Elna and her husband Warwick was one such structure. From a distance, it looked like a hunched beast in the fog, slouching under the weight of its own misery. The walls were made of wattle and daub, thin interwoven sticks caked in layers of mud, clay, and dung. In summer, the smell was bearable, especially when masked by wildflowers and burning peat. But come the rains of autumn or the thaw of spring, the reek seeped through like a curse. The roof was a lattice of bent saplings topped with damp straw. During storms, water trickled through the thatch in slender streams, pooling on the dirt floor. Warwick patched holes with tufts of old rags or moss when he could find it, but with each gust of wind, parts of the roof flapped like sails on a broken ship. Birds sometimes nested in the upper beams, mice nested below. There were no windows, only slits in the wall stuffed with cloth or straw. Light filtered in reluctantly, weak and gray like the sky. The single door, fashioned from two misshapen planks tied with rope, groaned each time it moved. It never quite shut completely, letting in the wind, the snow, and at times, curious foxes or the neighbor's goat. Inside, the floor was nothing more than trampled earth, often slick and sticky after a rain. Elna laid rushes across it, replacing them every few weeks to avoid infestation. Still, fleas thrived, and children often awoke with bites that scabbed over or turned foul. Their hearth, a shallow depression ringed with stones, smoked constantly. The chimney was a hole in the roof, but the wind twisted the smoke back inside more often than not. Soot blackened the rafters and clung to everything, bread, blankets, and breathing lungs. But in this bleak place, life went on. Children were born in these huts. Meals of porridge and root stew were shared. Songs were sung quietly during the evenings when the wind howled loudest. For all its flaws, this was home, not because it was comfortable, but because it was all they had. As autumn surrendered to the long siege of winter in Drindle Hollow, the ground beneath Elna and Warwick's hut transformed from dry dust to thick, sucking mud. The floor, never truly flat, formed unpredictable ridges and puddles. Elna joked bitterly that the children had learned to walk by hopping between dry patches. The joke wore thin when her youngest, Liz, fell into a moldy hole and came up coughing with filth in her mouth. The rushes that lined the ground, meant to absorb moisture and add a layer of comfort, had to be replaced weekly. Elna gathered them from the nearby marshes, cutting her hands on frozen reeds and slipping into icy waters. When rushes weren't available, she used bundles of straw, old linen, or sometimes even dried bracken. None of it lasted. None of it stayed clean, and within days parasites returned, feasting on what flesh they could find. Beneath the rushes, the true problem festered. The earth floor held centuries of trodden-in rot. Ash from the hearth, urine from children and the sick, blood from childbirths, and spillage from countless meals had all mingled over the years. No matter how often Elna tried to scrape it clean or throw new coverings, the stench always found a way to rise. In the summer, heat baked the stew of filth into a crust. In winter, it became ice with the bite of iron. Rodents were another plague. Mice chewed through cloth sacks of barley and nested near the warmth of the fire pit. Occasionally, a rat the size of a kitten would scurry across the room, bold enough to steal from a pot left uncovered. Elna set traps with old cheese or dried meat, but sometimes even the traps froze in place. Yet the family adjusted. Shoes, when they had them, were hung above the fire to dry. Everyone slept raised off the floor on bundles of hay or worn wooden pallets. Warwick even attempted to build a false wooden floor using scrap planks scavenged from the ruins of a burned barn. It creaked and groaned and eventually collapsed under his weight. But for a brief week, it felt like progress. Still, what comfort could be found was fleeting. Illnesses bred quickly in damp and dirty environments. Coughs became fevers, fevers turned into delirium, and once, during a cold snap, they lost their eldest daughter to a sickness that came in the night and stole her breath before dawn. The floor, Elna whispered to no one in particular, was cursed. Not by any wizard or ancient spirit, but by poverty itself, a punishment that seeped from below and reached into every joint and lung. And yet, each day, she swept it clean. She laid down fresh bracken. She sang over the sleeping children and stirred the ash of the hearth. Because if the floor was her enemy, then defiance was her only form of victory. By early spring, when the winds of Drindle Hollow blew sideways rather than down, Elna turned her attention to the walls of their home, if one dared call them that. Constructed in haste a generation ago, the hut was an ever-decaying patchwork of wattle and daub. A crisscrossed lattice of thin, crooked branches woven like an exhausted basket, smeared with a mix of straw, mud, dung, and ash. The original builders had likely done their best, but time, weather, and rats did not care for honest effort. Some days the walls wept. Water trickled between the dried daub, leaving pale trails like tears down a sickly face. In other seasons, the walls cracked like parched lips, shedding flakes of hardened dirt onto the rush-covered floor. Inside, the cold was a lingering tenant. Even when the hearth blazed at night, the air within the walls still hissed cold curses at those who dared to feel warmth. When the wind picked up from the west, it howled through the holes in the daub with a voice that seemed almost human, mournful, high-pitched, and relentless. Lys once asked Elna if the house had ghosts. Elna, too tired to lie, simply replied, "Not yet." Rain was the worst. The daub absorbed water greedily, swelling until it loosened, crumbled, or collapsed. On one occasion, half a wall buckled inward during a thunderstorm, bringing with it a colony of panicked spiders, 3 frogs, and enough mud to bury a sheep. Warwick rebuilt it the next morning with clenched jaw and numb fingers, mixing fresh dung with desperation, and cursing the skies for every drop that fell. Repairs were constant. Cracks were plugged with fresh muck. Drafts were blocked with old rags or flat stones. Inside the house, cloth was hung like banners to keep the wind from children's faces, and furniture, what little they had, was pushed against the most vulnerable places. Elna learned to read the wall like a healer reads a wound. A swelling bulge meant rain would leak soon. A new crack near the beam warned of future collapse. She even named parts of the structure: the crooked eye, the wailing corner, the rat tunnel. These weren't jokes. These were landmarks in her battle to survive within a home that seemed to resent her very presence. Despite everything, leaving was unthinkable. The hut, though crumbling and cold, was their shield against worse things. Wolves, cold nights, prying lords, and the blank silence of the forest. Every patch of dung plaster, every rotting beam, was history built by survival. And in that, there was a strange sort of pride. One spring morning, as Elna watched steam curl off the walls from the hearth's meager warmth, she allowed herself to imagine a house made of stone, with windows, and a door that actually shut. But the walls groaned again, and the dream vanished like heat into cracks. The roof of Elna's home was neither roof nor shelter in any true sense, merely a suggestion of protection that sagged like a tired back and leaked like a gossip with a secret, made of thatch layered thick from old rye straw and dry grass. The structure resembled a wilted crown slowly devouring itself from within. That spring, following 2 storms and a nesting season of starlings, the roof began to betray its final purpose. It started subtly, drips in the corner near the fire pit, the kind that found their way down your spine at night. Then, whole patches began to disintegrate, where it climbed up with a crude ladder, squinting into the mess of rot and bird droppings, muttering curses at both the heavens and the man who built the roof decades earlier. He stuffed it with more straw, more dung, even seaweed left from a passing merchant's barrow. Nothing held. By midsummer, the roof had turned into a sieve. When it rained indoors first. The family slept beneath an old fishing net stretched across beams, a poor man's tent within their own walls. Beneath it, they lined the floor with wooden bowls and ceramic pots to catch water, rearranging them at night like a gambler shuffling cards. Mold grew in long black streaks across the rafters. Mushrooms, small and white as mouse teeth, began to sprout in the corners. The children poked them with sticks until Elna slapped their hands. She had heard stories of people who ate roof fungus and wandered into the woods, never to return. Even on clear days, the roof whispered threat. Wind whistled between loosened thatch, stirring dust and dropping insects into bowls of soup. Birds perched atop and pecked away at fibers to build better nests elsewhere, as if mocking the humans for choosing to live in such decay. A jackdaw once fell through, flapping and shrieking into the hearth before escaping, singed and terrified. There were no shingles, no tiles, no gutter. Water rolled down the sides and splashed back into the walls, eroding them further. Occasionally, a beam groaned under the weight of wet straw. Elna lived with the daily fear that one morning she'd wake to the entire thing collapsing onto them as they slept, burying them in mold and memory. Fixing it impossible. Thatch was expensive unless you cut and dried it yourself. Warwick tried, spending 3 days in the meadows cutting grass with a curved blade, only to return with a bundle barely enough to cover a goat's shed. The rain returned faster than he could bind it. Eventually, Elna took to calling the inside of the house the second sky. And yet, as with the crumbling walls, the family endured. A roof that fails is better than no roof at all. Neighbors had it worse. A widow 2 fields over slept beneath a wagon cover nailed to posts. The priest's hut had collapsed entirely. Misery was measured not in suffering, but in comparison. At night, Elna lay on her straw mat, eyes tracing the stars that peeked through the thatch holes above, and wondered how people in stories lived in stone castles. She thought even rain must envy a place it cannot enter. But in Drindle Hollow, even the rain was king. Elna had always believed that a home was built from the ground up. But as the seasons passed and the wind grew bolder, it became clear that the very ground beneath their feet had declared war on comfort. There was no floor in their cottage, only dirt, hard-packed in summer like dried blood, and in spring soft and treacherous as a bog. It cracked in drought, it oozed in rain, and always it kept a memory of every foot that had ever stepped on it, hollowing beneath the heel and rising in ridges near the walls like a living skin trying to flee its bones. In the cold months, the dirt turned to stone. Elna would wake to find her toes numb and her calves cramped, no matter how tightly she wrapped herself in wool scraps or how close she curled to the hearth. A single log could not warm a floor that seemed to suck heat back into the earth. Children whimpered in their sleep, dreaming of warmth that never came. When it rained, and it often did, water snuck in through the sloped entrance or through the sinking foundation, pooling just enough to turn the floor into a glistening slick of mud. The family trudged through it barefoot, too poor to ruin shoes they only wore to the village chapel once a season. Their feet, perpetually damp, turned gray and blistered. Warts came and stayed. A cousin who visited once whispered of a man in the next valley whose toes fell off from soil that was cursed, and yet no one considered changing the floor. To add wood, one needed lumber, and lumber required coin or theft. Clay tiles were a fantasy, something only seen in the Baron's hall or in merchant stories. Even simple straw mats were scarce, devoured in months by rot or insects. Every few weeks, Elna would try to flatten the worst pits with an old hoe head tied to a stick. It did little. The floor fought back, rising like an ocean, swelling near the hearth and sinking near the bedding. Sometimes she imagined it was trying to consume them, inch by inch, drawing them closer to the grave with each barefoot step. Rats burrowed into it in winter, their tunnels collapsing underfoot with wet squelches. In the mornings, Elna would sweep away droppings with a bundle of reeds tied together, her only broom muttering that one day the rats would burst up through the center like a demon summoned from below. Still, there were moments of dark humor. On feast days, they pretended the mud was a ceremonial bath. When the neighbor's pig escaped and tracked manure inside, the children laughed as they slid in it, until Elna beat them clean with a wet rag. Even despair has corners where laughter can settle like dust. The earth they walked on never gave rest. It always moved, always reminded them that they were just tenants above the worms. Elna sometimes wondered if the dead were better off. At least the dirt above them was dry. But even with cracked walls, leaking roof, and a floor that could swallow you in your sleep, it was still home. There was no other word for it, no other place, and that was the cruelest part of all. The morning chill slid under the ragged door like a knife. In the tiny hamlet of Thornmere, nestled among the fog-wet hills of old Ardenwold, a cottage no larger than a shepherd's pen creaked in the early light. Inside, the ground not a floor, but the earth itself, held the cold like a secret. Aisla rubbed her arms, watching her breath curl in the air. The dirt beneath her bare feet was hard-packed, worn smooth from years of trampling. It bore the grooves of daily paths, from the fire pit to the straw bedding, from the door to the low shelf where turnips slept like corpses. There was no insulation between her and the world beneath. Just dirt. On good days it stayed dry. On bad days, which was most, it turned to sucking, sticky mud that clung to skin like hunger. Clay, when wet, was heavier than sorrow. In winter, the family scattered straw across the floor, hoping to trap some warmth. But straw was a luxury, stolen from the animals or begged from neighbors with pity to spare. It flattened quickly, soaked through with slop and spilled broth, then decomposed into a festering mulch that welcomed fleas, lice, and worse. The fleas were always there, in bedding, in clothing seams, in the straw. Aisla had grown used to the feeling of crawling legs on her skin. Bites swelled and itched, and the village midwife mumbled of blood rot and bone fever carried by the tiny beasts, but there were no cures. Just ashes rubbed into the skin, or sleeping on nettles to confuse the itching. Occasionally, desperate families lit small bundles of dried lavender and burned them near their mats, a poor man's fumigation. The smoke would send the fleas leaping like wildfire, but the victory was always short-lived. By the next dusk, they returned with vengeance, as if insulted by the attempt. Aisla's younger brother, Rune, once buried a lit coal under a cracked pot in the center of their sleeping mat, hoping the heat would warm their bones from the floor up. It had worked, until the pot shattered and the rush mat caught fire. They'd smothered it with their own bedding, beating the flames with thin arms and hoarse screams. No one scolded Rune. They all understood. The cold made you desperate. There were tales of houses with wooden floors in the distant towns, of merchants and millers who could afford flat boards that rose above the ground. But to the villagers of Thornmere, those were fairy tales. Floors were for kings, not for people who tilled soil with bleeding hands. Yet despite it all, the dirt was theirs, familiar. A cruel but steady foundation in a world that shifted like storm clouds. Aisla knew every crack in its surface, every dip and curve. She had been born on it, bled on it, would likely give birth on it one day. And when she died, it would cover her, just as it always had. By the time spring broke across Thornmere, the mud had risen like a curse. The thaw turned every inch of dirt floor into a slurry of filth and memory. Chickens wandered in and out of the huts, pecking through the muck for bugs. Dogs curled in damp corners, shivering from chill and mange. Children ran barefoot, skin permanently crusted with grime. No one remembered a time when feet had been clean. Aisla's mother, Elen, had once been proud of keeping their hovel swept, not with a broom, but a tight bundle of willow branches tied with horsehair. She would bend low each morning, brushing filth into the corners with steady, stubborn grace. But age and childbirth had worn her down. Her back ached constantly now, and her fingers stayed curled from years of labor. So Aisla took over. Every day before dawn, she swept. She didn't know why the dirt came back almost instantly, but there was something sacred in the ritual, a way of pushing back against rot. The act itself became prayer, Let today be cleaner than yesterday. In spring, they refilled the floor with fresh straw, dry, golden, newly cut. For a few days, the house smelled less of mildew and more of sunlight. Rune danced barefoot, pretending they lived in a castle with golden floors. The illusion never lasted. Rain dripped through the thatch, turning straw to sludge. Rats nested in the corners, close to where Elen stored their salted turnips and dried beans. "You hear them?" Elen asked one night, lying close to the wall. The faint skittering under the floor made Aisla shiver. "They're in the earth," she whispered. "They're in us," Elen corrected. "Always were." Despite the straw, parasites multiplied. Aisla picked fleas from Rune's scalp and crushed them with her fingernails, watching his blood smear her skin. He flinched, but never cried. They'd learned early not to waste tears. Their father, Torik, had once tried boiling their clothes, thinking heat might cleanse them. The pot split, and the water ruined the last of their blankets. Neighbors shared similar miseries. Old Widow Male had filled her floor with dried reeds and catmint, hoping the scent would keep the vermin away. It didn't. She died of fever weeks later, found half-eaten by the very rats she'd fought. The village healer claimed the problem wasn't the fleas, but the sins in the walls. He instructed families to burn garlic on the hearth and hang bits of foxtail over their children's beds. Elen muttered a prayer every time she touched the threshold, fingers brushing the dirt as if to make peace with it. At night, silence was not peace but dread. When the house went still, the sounds beneath returned louder, scratching, crawling, tiny chittering in the floor. Sometimes they spoke, voices made of hunger and ancient filth. "Don't listen," Elen warned. "That's not the rats. That's the memory of everything buried beneath." Aisla once dreamed of a floor made of stone, clean, smooth, unchanging. But even in her dream, the stones cracked, and from the gaps came the fleas, the cold, and the whispers. She woke with her hand pressed into wet earth. In the village of Thornmere, nightfall was a curse as much as a respite. Though the day brought work and weariness, the night brought infestation. Once the fires burned low and the chickens ceased clucking beneath the benches, the ground stirred to life. Beneath layers of damp straw and compressed filth, a miniature kingdom flourished. Fleas, mites, ticks, and earwigs nested alongside lice and tiny black beetles. But it was the mice that truly ruled. They came in silence, their beady eyes gleaming through thatched gaps, burrowing beneath beds of straw, chewing on remnants of bread, buttons from cloaks, and the soft toes of sleeping infants. For every child born in Thornmere, a mouse likely witnessed its first breath or its last. Torik, the father, tried everything. He carved traps from bone and wood, baiting them with dried meat or bits of suet. Some mice died, but more came. He once caught a rat the size of a kitten. Rune named it Father's Devil, and they strung its corpse above the doorframe as a warning. The next night, they heard another one gnawing beneath the cradle. The floor was alive, not just metaphorically, but physically. The squelch of rot beneath heel, the skitter of things unseen, the strange warmth of decay that emanated from beneath the house's surface like breath from a fevered child. Elen began insisting they sleep sitting up, fearing what might crawl across them in the night. Rune developed a cough that echoed wetly in the rafters. Aisla begged for boiled water to wash the bedding. There was none to spare. Worse still was the itching madness, as it came to be known. People would scratch themselves bloody. Their skin blistered, peeled, and scabbed. An old man named Croft tore his own ear off one night, convinced something was crawling inside it. He died the next morning, and his family burned his straw bedding in the village square. Though it smoked foul and sent choking black plumes into the spring sky, Elaine refused to let Aisla visit Croft's widow. "What's in their house'll jump into your hair," she warned. "And once it gets into your blood, girl, not even a priest'll scare it out." But it wasn't just the insects. It was the fear. The dread that everything in the earth was pushing up, hungry, patient, ancient. In dreams, Aisla saw faces forming in the dirt beneath her floor. Small, pale, bloated eyes and grinning teeth made of stone and bone. She'd wake gagging, straw stuck to her tongue. The walls of their hut leaned in like they were collapsing in prayer. Even the roof sighed with rot. When the local lord's men passed through the village 1 week to collect grain, they recoiled from the huts. One soldier muttered, "I'd rather sleep in a latrine." Another claimed his boot melted through the straw. They left laughing, kicking up mud and pestilence as they rode away. But Aisla watched them go with a deep, rising thought. They don't live with the floor. The floor is something no one escapes in Thornmere. It was not foundation, it was fate. A living skin of the land, cracking beneath bare feet, holding within it every sickness, sorrow, and secret that the villagers refused to say aloud. By midsummer, the ground no longer simply housed Thornmere's misfortunes. It was birthing them. A wave of illness crept across the village like a shadow that never lifted. It began with tremors, subtle shivering under the skin, not from cold, but from some internal, unseen malice. Then came the sweating, the blistering, the rasping coughs that stuck to the back of the throat like pitch. People began falling where they stood. In the fields, at the hearth, in the churchyard. They called it straw fever. The villagers didn't understand why it spread so fast, but Aisla noticed something no one dared speak of. Each home that fell sick had floors with older, thicker straw. Mold blackened, compressed, matted with blood, milk, and decay. She remembered how her mother used to say that straw should be changed often. But who could afford such luxuries now, when livestock died from the heat and trade routes were choked by bandits? The pestilence lingered not just in the air, it clung to the ground, to the things buried and forgotten. The straw, once laid as protection, was a sponge soaked in years of waste, hiding beneath its yellow fringe the true rot of their lives. Aisla's father, Torek, fell ill next. He insisted it was nothing, but within a day he was delirious. His lips cracked like scorched earth, and his eyes darted around the dim room, following things no one else could see. "There's something digging," he whispered, clawing at the floor. "The dirt, it's calling names." They laid him on fresh straw. Elaine soaked cloths in mint water and prayed, but nothing stopped the shaking. That night he died. The village priest, Father Lamb, came the next morning, his robe stiff with old wax and sweat. He performed last rites while standing as far from the corpse as possible, muttering holy words while covering his mouth with linen soaked in vinegar. When he saw the state of the hut, the worms in the floor, the crawling walls, the stench, he crossed himself twice, and told Hélène she should consider burning the house. But they didn't. Where else would they go? That week, 5 more villagers died. One boy was buried half alive when the grave diggers grew too exhausted to check his breath. The bell in the church stopped ringing for the dead. It rang constantly now, a hollow, senseless toll in the distance. Rune, too young to understand death's grip, asked Aisla, "Do you think the floor eats people when they die?" Aisla wanted to laugh, but her brother's question echoed in her bones, because it did feel that way. The villagers began laying stones on their floors, smooth river stones, bones of animals, planks stolen from collapsed barns, anything to lift themselves even an inch above the hungry earth. Aisla lined her own corner with bark and moss, but it barely helped. One night she heard scratching again. Not mice, not bugs, but something bigger beneath her bed. The straw shifted unnaturally, and then silence. When she checked beneath the next morning, she found claw marks on the packed earth. Human-sized. The final days of autumn brought no peace to Thornmere. Only more wind, more death, and more silence between the screams. Aisla barely slept. Each night she sat upright, watching the candle stub on her windowsill flicker from drafts that had no source. The straw beneath her shifted, now even when no one walked across it. It rustled as if breathing. No matter how much they swept or burned, lice and fleas returned within hours. Her legs were blackened with bites. Hélène had started scratching in her sleep until she bled. The villagers spoke less now. Father Lamb no longer came to bless the sick. He'd locked himself inside the chapel, claiming divine instruction to isolate in prayer. When Aisla tried to knock, no one answered, but she heard whispering behind the doors, too many voices for a single man. The fever faded in some homes, burned out in others. But what remained behind was worse. Children staring at corners for hours, parents muttering to walls, animals refusing to enter huts they once slept in. Something had changed in the village, not in the people, but in the homes themselves. One evening, Aisla ventured into old widow Berna's house after seeing smoke rising from her broken chimney, though Berna had been dead for weeks. Inside, she found no fire, just warmth. The room steamed gently, the air moist like breath. Straw on the floor pulsed in and out, subtly, like lungs. Aisla backed away, nearly tripping over a mound that hadn't been there before. It squished underfoot, warm and soft. When she pulled back the straw, she found Berna's old shawl folded on what looked disturbingly like flesh. The floor was no longer earth. It had become something else. That night Aisla tore up every bundle of straw in their hut. She dug into the dirt with a broken pan until her hands bled. Beneath the straw, she found something she hadn't expected. Bones, dozens of them, some human, some not, all gnawed clean, as if the house had fed. Hélène stopped her. "You're scaring Rune," she whispered. "I'm scaring you," Aisla replied, shaking. "Because you know I'm right." Then came the final sign. A scream from the southern edge of Thornmere. They ran and found 2 homes collapsed inward, not from fire, not from weather. The roofs had fallen in because the floors below had sucked them down. No survivors, just soil bubbling like boiling soup. The villagers gathered at the square. Old Cedric, who'd lived through the famine of '28, spoke first. "We built on cursed land." "No," Aisla said, her voice cutting across the cold. "We built cursed homes." They burned their houses that night, one by one in silence. As flames tore through straw and rot and dark, the sound that came from beneath, a long, groaning wail, shook the earth. When it was over, the village stood in ashes. The survivors, only 25 of the original 92, built new shelters on stone far from the ruins. No straw, no thatch, no soil beneath their beds. They slept on raised planks with fire always burning. Aisla kept a dagger by her side and salt around her door. Thornmere never grew again, but it lived, just far enough from the ground to forget what it had once hidden. In the remote village of Eldwin, nestled between thick pine forests and misty hills, the hearth was more than just a place to make fire. It was the soul of every home. Long before dawn, when cold seeped through cracks in wooden walls and frost painted fragile patterns on glassless windows, the first light came not from the sun, but from the flickering embers in the stone hearth of Ilara's cottage. Ilara was a slender woman with calloused hands, yet her touch with fire was tender. Each morning, she coaxed the flame awake, feeding it dry twigs and scraps of pine bark collected from the forest edge. The fire's gentle crackling pushed away the biting chill, bathing the rough-hewn walls in warmth and golden light. This hearth was where the family gathered, her husband Bram, their 2 children, and her aging mother. Around the fire, the world outside melted away. The children's laughter mingled with the popping of kindling. Bram sharpened his hunting knife, its blade catching sparks. Ilara stirred a pot suspended above the flames, where a thick stew simmered, filling the room with rich aromas of wild herbs, roasted roots, and dried venison. But the hearth was not just a place of comfort. It was a battleground. The smoke that rose in lazy spirals from the open chimney carried more than warmth. It fought off the relentless swarm of gnats and biting insects that plagued their lives. Tiny creatures buzzed and crawled on the walls, but none dared cross the smoky veil that curled through the room. Ilara learned early that a hearth's fire was both protector and provider. When the wind howled through the gaps in the logs or rain hammered the roof, the flame stood steadfast, a flickering beacon of hope. It was the only thing that kept the cold and the darkness at bay. Outside the window, the village stirred to life. Smoke from neighboring hearths twisted upward, weaving a tapestry of flickering lights that mirrored the stars fading with dawn. Yet, the hearth in Ilara's home held a different weight. It was their fortress against the merciless wilderness. Every day, tending the fire was a ritual passed down through generations. It required patience and respect, for fire could nourish or destroy. Ilara spoke to it softly, as if the flame were a living being, and in return it rewarded her with light, heat, and safety. As the sun rose higher, warming the world beyond, the hearth's glow softened but never faded. It was the heart of the house, the pulse that kept their family alive through frost, hunger, and fear. As night swallowed the village of Eldwin, the hearth's glow grew stronger, casting long, dancing shadows across the uneven stone floor. The children, weary from a day spent chasing rabbits and gathering berries, nestled close to the fire, their faces flushed with warmth. Outside, a chill wind whispered secrets through the skeletal branches. But inside Alara's cottage, the fire roared like a guardian. The hearth was no mere convenience. It was the engine of survival. Alara carefully arranged thick logs atop the glowing embers, their cracked surfaces releasing bursts of orange sparks that spiraled toward the dark rafters. With each crackle and pop, the fire's warmth seeped deeper into the walls made of rough timber and daubed clay. The smoke curled upward, thick and pungent, filling the room with a scent that was both comforting and harsh, a constant reminder of the cost of comfort. In this close, smoky space, the hearth also performed another crucial role. It was a purifier. The smoke, drifting in steady currents, kept away swarms of fleas and gnats that thrived in the dampness of the packed earth floor and the straw bedding. These tiny invaders could carry disease or torment sleepers through the night. Alara understood that without the smoke's invisible shield, her family would be vulnerable to countless ailments. The fire was also a storyteller's stage. As darkness wrapped the village in silence, Bram would tell tales of old battles and faraway lands, his voice low and steady over the crackling flames. Alara's mother, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, hummed ancient lullabies, the smoke twisting in time with her voice. The hearth was a hearth was a hearth was a hearth, an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. But tending this sacred flame was a constant struggle. The wet winters soaked the wood, making it stubborn to ignite. Summer storms could snuff out the flames, plunging the family into cold darkness and inviting fear. On some nights, when the wind pressed heavy against the walls, the smoke would fill the room more than it escaped, choking the breath and forcing hurried coughs. Alara's eyes would sting, yet she never let the fire die. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, the fire became a mirror to their hardships. The dancing shadows could appear like looming monsters, whispering threats of famine, sickness, or war. Yet, within those same flames burned a fierce resolve, a stubborn refusal to surrender to the merciless wilderness that surrounded them. The hearth was their protector, their warmth, their heart, and Alara, its devoted keeper, knew that as long as the fire lived, so did hope. The morning sun filtered weakly through the narrow window slits, casting pale light onto the hearth where the last embers still glowed faintly. Alara was already awake, her fingers nimble as they gathered kindling and dry twigs from the small pile beside the hearth. Today was market day in Eldwin, and a good fire would be essential for preparing the meager food they hoped to barter. Alara's younger brother, Tomas, sat nearby, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His stomach growled, a reminder that yesterday's scant meal was all they had until tonight. The fire would soon be their ally in turning hard rye bread and salted pork into something more bearable. Even if the meals were simple and often repetitive, the hearth transformed them into a ritual of comfort and survival. Ilara placed a heavy black pot over the fire, its iron surface pocked and scarred from years of use. Soon, she added a handful of wild herbs, sage and thyme collected from the nearby woods, and some dried root vegetables that had been stored in the cold cellar. The flames licked the pot's sides, sending a warm, savory aroma through the cramped cottage. But the hearth was not just a kitchen. It was also a place where news traveled. Villagers would gather around the fire during long winters or stormy nights, exchanging stories, warnings, and gossip. The firelight flickered on the faces of traders, farmers, and craftsmen, all bound by the fragile community's shared need for warmth and sustenance. Yet beneath the hearth's comforting glow, danger simmered. The smoke that guarded against pests also carried the risk of suffocation if the chimney was blocked or the winds shifted. And if the fire was left unattended, the entire wooden house could be consumed in moments, an ever-present threat lurking just beyond the hearth's glow. Ilara's mother cautioned her often, "Respect the fire, for it gives life and takes it away just as quickly." Those words echoed as Ilara stirred the simmering stew, mindful of the fine balance they walked between nourishment and destruction. As midday approached, the cottage filled with the scent of cooking food and the soft crackle of the hearth. Tomas's eyes brightened with hope, and even Ilara allowed herself a small smile. In a world rife with hardship, the fire was a rare constant, a small miracle in the heart of their humble home. As twilight deepened outside the small cottage, the flickering firelight inside cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Ilara sat close to the hearth, carefully tending the embers while her mother wove coarse yarn into a patchwork cloth. The warmth of the fire was a fragile barrier against the biting cold that crept through the gaps in the walls and the thatched roof. The hearth's smoke curled upward, threading through a crude chimney made from stacked stones and clay. It was meant to carry the poisonous fumes outside, but often it struggled. On still nights, the smoke would drift back inside, stinging their eyes and choking the small room. Ilara's father had once tried to improve the chimney, but with limited resources and knowledge, it remained a rudimentary vent at best. Despite this, the smoke played a vital role beyond mere ventilation. Its pungent aroma kept away hordes of insects, mosquitoes, flies, and fleas that thrived in the damp countryside. In a house where the floors were made of packed earth, and straw bedding offered little protection, the smoke was a shield against the invisible army of parasites that could bring disease and misery. Ilara coughed as a particularly thick cloud rolled into the room, but she did not move from her post. To leave the fire unattended was to risk losing everything. The fire was their protector, their provider, and their punishment if mishandled. Outside, the village was settling into uneasy quiet. Night brought its own dangers, roaming wolves, thieves, and the ever-present fear of a fire breaking out in a neighboring home, which could spread like wildfire through the tightly clustered cottages. The hearth was both a beacon of safety and a potential disaster. Ilara's thoughts drifted to the stories her grandmother told, how ancestors had gathered around great hearths for celebrations, sharing songs and feasts. Here, in this modest hut, The fire was smaller, but no less important. It held their hopes, their struggles, and their fragile connection to a world that often seemed dark and unforgiving. As the night deepened, Ilara added another bundle of twigs, coaxing the fire back to life. The smoke spiraled upward, carrying with it the scent of herbs, memories, and survival. In the heart of this simple home, the hearth remained their constant companion against the cold, the pests, and the night itself. With dawn's pale light filtering through the woven reed window, the cottage stirred to life once again. Ilara rose from her straw pallet, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and made her way to the hearth, the ever-glowing heart of the home. The fire was now reduced to a bed of glowing coals, its warmth still radiating gently against the morning chill. Each day began with ritual. Ilara's mother kindled fresh wood, feeding the embers carefully, while Ilara prepared a simple breakfast of coarse bread and watered-down ale. Around the hearth, they gathered not only for warmth and nourishment, but for moments of connection, storytelling, and prayers whispered into the curling smoke. The fire's flickering flames were believed to carry their voices to the unseen world, spirits of ancestors and protective forces watching over their fragile lives. Lighting certain herbs, sage, rosemary, or juniper, was a sacred act to cleanse the air and guard against illness and misfortune. The hearth was a sacred place, where mundane life met the spiritual, and where hope was kindled alongside flame. But the hearth was also a daily test of endurance. Fuel was scarce, and each piece of wood was precious. Gathering branches from the surrounding forest was a dangerous task. Often, bandits or wild beasts lurked beyond the trees. The fire's smoke betrayed their presence, so Ilara's family had to keep their hearth modest and humble, never daring to burn too brightly or for too long. Despite the hardships, the hearth remained a symbol of resilience, a steadfast companion through cold winters, fevers, and despair. Its flames illuminated faces worn by toil, but filled with determination. Around this smoky, crackling fire, generations had endured, loved, and dreamed. As Ilara poked at the fire one last time before stepping outside to face the day, she felt a deep, unspoken bond with those who had come before her. The hearth was more than just wood and smoke. It was the beating heart of survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. In the small hamlet of Dunwoyd, where biting winds swept relentlessly across the moorlands, the nights were a test of endurance. For Mara and her family, surviving the cold did not rely solely on the roaring blaze of their hearth, but on a delicate, ancient craft, banking the fire. As dusk fell, Mara's father, Tomas, crouched before the dying embers, his hands practiced and steady. He carefully pushed glowing coals deeper into the ash bed, then layered thick, gray ash over them like a protective blanket. This layer, seemingly dull and lifeless, was the secret to preserving warmth through the long night. The ashes acted as insulation, trapping the heat in the coals beneath, smoldering slowly without burning away. Inside the small wattle and daub cottage, the family huddled close, sharing the heat stored beneath the ashes. Mara's mother, Elin, covered the hearth with a large iron lid, and placed dampened clay tiles around it to keep cold drafts at bay. Outside, the wind howled and rattled the shutters. But inside, the embers, hidden glow whispered promises of a dawn warm enough to rise to. The skill of banking the fire was more than a mere chore. It was a matter of life or death. The wood was precious and scarce. To waste it by letting the fire die out meant risking frostbite or worse before the morning. Children learned from their elders the careful rhythm of tending the coals. Neither too much air, which would burn the fire out quickly, nor too little, which would smother it completely. At night, only the faintest glow peeked from beneath the ash. It was a ghostly reminder that life persisted, that the fire, like hope itself, was merely sleeping, waiting to be awakened. As the moon rose high over Dunwoyd, the cottage settled into a fragile peace. The fire, carefully banked beneath its ash blanket, pulsed with a faint warmth, enough to keep the chill at bay. But even this quiet warmth demanded vigilance. Mara, barely 12 winters old, was entrusted with a sacred duty. She was the night watch. Wrapped in a coarse woolen cloak, she sat close to the hearth, her breath misting in the cold air as she listened for any sign that the embers were fading. The night was long, and the cold crept slowly, threatening to steal the heat away. Her fingers brushed the iron lid, checking if it was still warm. A sudden draft from a crack in the door sent a shiver through the room, and Mara hurried to seal it with a scrap of old cloth. Every sound echoed in the silence. The creak of timber, the distant howl of wolves, the soft crackle of dying embers. Outside, the howling wind carried snowflakes that danced like restless spirits. Inside, the smoke from the fire curled upward, its acrid scent mingling with the earthy musk of damp clay walls. This smoke was more than a byproduct. It kept away the biting insects and small vermin that sought shelter in the warmth. Despite the hardships, the hearth was the heart of the home, a fragile sanctuary against the relentless cold and darkness. Mara's family depended on her watchful eye, and she felt the weight of this responsibility as heavily as the cold pressing in from outside. Every hour she would stir the ashes lightly, coaxing the embers to breathe, making sure the fire's heart still beat beneath the gray shroud. The ritual was as old as the village itself, a secret passed down through generations. As dawn approached, the warmth beneath the ash still glowed softly. Mara's vigil was nearly over. Soon, her father would rake the embers back to life, and the cottage would once again be filled with crackling flames and bright light. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the tiny, shuttered window of the cottage, Bryn stirred from his restless sleep. The chill of the night still clung to the air, but the embers hidden beneath the thick layer of ash glowed faintly, a silent promise of life waiting to be rekindled. Bryn rose carefully, mindful not to disturb the sleeping children or his wife, Elira. His breath hung in soft clouds, mixing with the lingering smoke that filled the cramped room. The hearth was the soul of their home, and each morning demanded the same ritual, a delicate resurrection of fire from the ashes. Kneeling beside the hearth, Bryn gently brushed away the cold ash with a small iron poker, revealing the warm, glowing coals beneath. The heat that radiated was weak, but steady, a flicker of hope after the long, freezing night. He blew softly, coaxing the embers to flare, careful not to let them die completely. As the flames began to dance and leap once more, the cottage slowly came alive. The smoke curled upward, filling the room with its familiar, earthy scent that was both comforting and harsh. Elira stirred, stretching her tired limbs, and soon the children awoke, rubbing their eyes against the dim morning light. Outside, the village of Asheville was still cloaked in frost, but the sounds of morning, clucking hens, the distant lowing of cattle, and the crunch of footsteps in snow signaled the start of another day of survival. Each household depended on this fire ritual, a fragile shield against the biting cold and endless hardships of rural life. Bryn's hands, calloused from years of labor, worked with practiced ease as he stoked the fire higher. This flame would not only warm them, but cook their meager meals and provide light in the darkness. It was a lifeline, a daily rebirth. Yet even as the hearth grew stronger, Bryn knew the danger never truly passed. A sudden gust through a cracked window could snuff out the fragile flame, and with it, the fragile hope that kept their family alive. In this harsh world, the fire was their closest ally and most precious treasure, a constant battle to keep it alive, as vital as the very air they breathed. As twilight faded into the dense blackness of night, the village of Asheville settled into an uneasy quiet. Inside the humble cottages, families huddled close to the hearth, the warm glow casting flickering shadows on rough-hewn walls. But the battle to keep the fire alive was far from over. For Bryn and his kin, the hearth was both guardian and burden. As the night deepened and cold seeped through cracks in the timber walls, the ember's faint pulse demanded constant attention. One careless moment, and the flame might surrender to the darkness, condemning the household to freezing despair. Bryn took up his place as the night's sentinel, eyes fixed on the hearth as he gently stirred the glowing coals. The task required vigilance. Too much ash could smother the fire, too little kindling left it vulnerable. He fed it small branches, and dry straw scavenged during the day, nurturing the fragile warmth like a living thing. Outside, the howl of wind rattled loose shutters and moaned through the skeletal trees. The cold was relentless, an invisible enemy pressing on every side. Within the stone and timber walls, the hearth's smoky breath was a fragile shield against nature's cruelty. Elira watched from her place near the fire, her hands busy mending worn clothing by its uncertain light. Her gaze often drifted to the small, sleeping forms of their children, curled beneath threadbare blankets. Each night was a gamble. The flicker of firelight was their bulwark against illness, hunger, and the harsh bite of winter. Yet the hearth was not merely a source of heat. Its smoke, bitter and stinging, kept away the persistent gnats and fleas that plagued their restless sleep. The fire's light also warded off the shadows of fear and loneliness, binding the family in a circle of warmth and fragile safety. In the dim glow, Bryn's thoughts wandered to the fleeting joys of summer, the days when the fire was less a necessity and more a comfort. But those memories were distant, and tonight, as every night, the fire's survival was the family's lifeline. As the embers flickered low and the night deepened, Bryn steeled himself for another long vigil. Because in this world, the fight to keep the hearth alive was a fight for life itself. The first pale light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, spilling muted gold across the frost-tinged fields surrounding Asheville. Inside the small cottage, the embers in the hearth still glowed faintly, a testament to the night's unyielding watch. Bryn's weary arms stretched as he rose, the chill biting at his bones despite the lingering warmth at his feet. The night's vigil had been long and fraught, but the fire had survived, smoldering under a veil of ash, ready to be coaxed back to life. Elira stoked the coals gently, breath mingling with thin spirals of smoke as the hearth began to crackle and roar anew. The fire's return was like a heartbeat in the house, signaling safety and renewal. Outside, the village stirred, farmhands preparing for another day of backbreaking labor, children rubbing sleep from their eyes, and neighbors greeting one another with cautious smiles. Life went on, fragile yet persistent, much like the flame that had burned through the darkest hours. Bryn stepped to the doorway, inhaling the crisp morning air mixed with wood smoke and damp earth. He glanced back at the hearth, that stubborn heart of the home, and felt a surge of quiet pride. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, where illness and cold and hunger loomed like specters, the simple act of keeping a fire alive was a victory. It was a promise that the family would face another day together. For all its hardships, the hearth was their anchor, the glowing center around which stories were told, meals were shared, and love endured against the relentless pull of the night. As the sun climbed higher, casting light on the weathered faces of Asheville, the warmth from the hearth mingled with the hope carried on the morning breeze. And in that fragile light, life, like the fire, persisted. In the biting cold of an Eldermore winter, the tiny stone cottage of the Hawthorns stood battered by the relentless wind. Outside, frost clung to the barren trees, and the earth was frozen hard as iron. Inside, the hearth's dying embers cast flickering shadows on the rough walls, barely pushing back the chill that crept into every corner. Myra Hawthorne, the youngest of 5 siblings, shivered under a threadbare blanket. Her breath formed tiny clouds in the cold air as she huddled close to her older brother, Jory, who wrapped a heavy wool cloak tighter around her shoulders. Their parents, Tomas and Hélène, sat nearby, trying to mend a torn sack by the flickering firelight. Yet warmth was scarce, not just from the fading fire, but from the harsh world outside. Food was running low, the winter's bite had sapped the village's strength, and the family's animals, housed in the cramped adjoining stable, made strange noises that echoed through the thin wooden walls. When night fell fully, the family prepared for their nightly ritual, a practice born of necessity and centuries of hardship. Sleeping together, packed like a puzzle, humans and animals alike, to share every ounce of warmth possible. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a deadly adversary in a time before stoves and insulated walls. Myra's small hand found the rough fur of a goat resting nearby, its body radiating a surprising heat. The animals, though dirty and smelly, were vital companions, Their warmth could mean the difference between life and death when the wind howled like a wild beast outside. In the dim light, the family shifted carefully, making room for the restless sheep and the old farm dog, who settled at the foot of the bed with a deep sigh. There was little privacy here. Everything was shared. Space, breath, and the fragile hope of surviving another freezing night. As the cold seeped deeper, the house creaked and groaned, but within that cramped huddle, a quiet comfort blossomed. The family's combined warmth, their shared bodies and steady heartbeats, fought back the darkness and the cold, one night at a time. As dawn crept slowly over Eldermore, the Hawthorne family stirred beneath their tangled nest of blankets, straw, and fur. Their shared slumber had kept the biting cold at bay, but only barely. Outside, the frozen landscape shimmered under a pale winter sun. But inside the cottage, the chill still lingered, seeping into bones like an unwelcome guest. In a time before central heating or even glass windows, every ounce of body heat mattered. Each person, each animal, was a living radiator in the cramped, drafty homes of the village. The more bodies packed tightly together, the warmer the room became. It was a practical, if uncomfortable, solution to an unforgiving environment. The Hawthornes lived by an unspoken rule. Family and livestock must coexist under one roof through the harsh seasons. Livestock, though often smelly and messy, were essential for survival, not only for food but for warmth. The animals' thick coats radiated heat through the night, a small barrier against the numbing cold. Myra's older sister, Elena, rose first to tend the animals. The wooden floor creaked beneath her worn boots, and the smell of hay mixed with animal musk filled the air. She whispered to the goats, careful not to wake the younger children still wrapped in the heap of blankets. In the village, the communal knowledge was clear. Humans alone could not defeat the winter chill. Shelter was poor, walls thin and cracked, and the draft from gaps in the roof seemed to breathe cold air into the very soul of the home. So the body heat economy was an unyielding part of life. Cattle in the same room, the dog curled at the foot of the bed, and every family member pressed close together to share warmth. But this closeness came with its own hardships. The cramped quarters bred discomfort and frustration. The stench of animals mixed with the sweat and unwashed bodies of the family members was constant. Fleas and lice were omnipresent, making the nights restless and the skin irritated. Still, this was the price of warmth and survival. As the day stretched on, the Hawthornes would separate to their chores, gathering wood, fetching water, repairing the thatch on the roof. But each evening, the family would return to their nightly ritual. Against the harsh wilderness and biting cold, the human body became both fortress and flame. As the sun dipped behind the knotted hills surrounding Eldermore, the cottage grew colder with each passing minute. The Hawthorne family prepared for the night's battle against frost and darkness. A ritual filled with whispered negotiations, careful maneuvering, and silent concessions. Myra, the youngest daughter, clutched a threadbare blanket close around her shoulders as she entered the crowded main room. Her father, Brahm, was already settled near the hearth, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on his weathered face. Next to him, the family's prized cow, Bess, lowed softly, settling into her usual spot by the doorway. In the cramped space, every inch mattered. The older children jostled for their favored spots, nearest the fire or closest to the animals, depending on their preference. Even the dog, a scrappy mongrel named Rook, claimed a corner of the floor, his body curled tight to conserve heat. Each night was a balancing act. Too close to the fire meant stifling heat. Too far, and the cold would bite at exposed skin. The family had learned over years how to manage the delicate equilibrium between warmth and suffocation. As Myra climbed onto the wooden pallet that served as her bed, she felt the weight of her siblings pressing against her side, their breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet room. The animals stirred occasionally, snorting, shifting, or occasionally sneezing, reminding everyone of the ever-present, shared struggle. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the thin walls and making the humble home creak like an ancient ship in a storm. But inside, the combined warmth of bodies, breath, and fire held the cold at bay, at least until dawn. Despite the hardships, the closeness forged bonds, grudgingly formed alliances between family members and animals alike, all united by the shared goal of surviving the relentless winter nights. Morning light crept hesitantly through the cracks of the wooden shutters, casting thin beams across the cramped interior of the small cottage. The chill of the night still clung to the air, and the faint scent of smoke mingled with damp straw. Myra awoke slowly, her limbs stiff but her heart warmed by the closeness of her family. Around her, the others stirred, Brahm's deep sighs as he stretched, the soft murmurs of her mother, Elin, rousing the youngest siblings. The animals, too, sensed the new day. Bess shifted on her hay, and Rook stretched with a lazy yawn. Despite the hardships of shared sleep, sardined bodies, the occasional snore, the ever-present threat of fleas, the family had survived another night. The animals, once thought an inconvenience indoors, were vital partners in this battle against the cold. Their body heat was a precious resource, as valuable as any blanket or firewood. Breakfast preparations began quietly. Elin kindled the hearth once more, coaxing flames from smoldering embers carefully banked the night before. The smell of porridge soon filled the room, a simple but nourishing start to the day. Outside, the village slowly stirred. Smoke from other hearths rose like gentle wisps into the clear morning sky, and the low murmur of greetings and barter echoed faintly through the crisp air. Yet as the Hawthorne family faced another day in their humble abode, the lesson remained clear. Survival was a communal effort. The cramped nights, shared warmth, and close quarters were not just burdens. They were lifelines, binding humans and animals in a fragile but unbreakable web of coexistence. As dusk fell once more over the village of Alderbrook, a familiar ritual began within the humble walls of the Hawthorne cottage. The day's labors behind them, the family gathered close, bodies huddled tightly together beneath threadbare blankets and patched cloaks. The small animals, too, nestled in the corners and on laps, their warmth seeping into the weary humans. Outside, the biting wind howled, rattling loose shutters and sending leaves swirling down the muddy paths. Inside, The fire sputtered, its fading glow a fragile shield against the encroaching cold. The room was cramped, often stifling. But in this close proximity was a quiet kind of comfort, an unspoken promise that no one would face the night alone. In this era, when nights were long and merciless, and the threat of sickness or famine loomed constantly, the shared struggle forged bonds deeper than words. Myra looked around at her family, the tired eyes of her father, the gentle smile of her mother, the sleepy contentment of her siblings. Together, they weathered the harshness of medieval life. This closeness was more than necessity, it was survival. The warmth of many bodies, the rhythmic breathing in unison, the presence of loved ones and loyal beasts, all intertwined to push back the relentless chill. The cold was a foe they could not fight with weapons, only with unity and endurance. As Myra's eyelids grew heavy, she found solace in the small, simple miracle of warmth, knowing that through the coldest nights and darkest times, their shared strength would carry them through. In the remote village of Bramblewood, nestled among tangled woods and frost-bitten fields, the small stone cottage of the Fenwick family buzzed with the sounds of an unusual household. Beyond the creaking door and wattle walls, the air was thick not only with smoke and the scent of burning peat, but also with the unmistakable musk of animals that shared the cramped space with humans. Inside, young Aloin moved carefully between the dirt floor and the low beams, tending to the flock of sheep that huddled in one corner, their thick wool brushing against the wooden walls. Nearby, a pair of goats nibbled nervously on dried stalks of hay, while the family's loyal pig, Marlowe, rooted contentedly beneath a faded tapestry. These creatures were more than just livestock. They were vital sources of warmth in the unforgiving cold. Winter nights in Bramblewood could be cruel. Temperatures plunged below freezing, and the howling wind threatened to seep through every crack and crevice. The Fenwicks had long since abandoned the idea of keeping animals outside in such conditions. Instead, they brought them indoors to share their limited heat. The animals' bodies radiated warmth, a necessary buffer against the biting chill that gnawed at bone and spirit alike. Yet living with livestock inside the cottage was no simple arrangement. The mingling smells of earth, manure, and sweat clung stubbornly to every surface, infiltrating clothes and hair. The floor, mudded by the trample of hooves and paws, was a perpetual mess, impossible to clean fully in the cold and damp. Fleas and other pests found abundant hiding places among the straw bedding and wooden beams, tormenting both humans and animals. Despite the grime and discomfort, the Fenwicks accepted these hardships without complaint. Life in Bramblewood was a constant battle against nature's harshness, and the animals were both warmth providers and a fragile lifeline to survival. For Aloin's family, sharing their home with livestock was not a matter of choice. It was a necessity born of love, endurance, and the raw will to live through another brutal season. As dawn's pale light seeped through the small, soot-stained window, Aloin woke to the familiar chorus of grunts, bleats, and rustling straw. The animals were already stirring, their breath misting in the cold morning air that clung stubbornly to the cottage's rough timber walls. The once comforting warmth now carried the heavy, unmistakable odor of a lived-in barnyard. A pungent mixture of hay, animal sweat, and something more acrid, the scent of dried dung and damp earth. For the Fenwick family, this smell was an ever-present companion. It seeped into the clothes hung near the hearth, into the cracks of the wooden floorboards, and even into the very air they breathed. Visitors often recoiled at the stench, but to Eloin and her kin, it was simply the cost of survival. The cold was merciless, and the animals were their best defense against freezing nights. Yet the smell was only one of many challenges. The animals' presence inside the home brought constant dirt and disorder. Feathered hens scratched nervously at the straw, scattering it about the floor. Piles of manure accumulated quickly, forcing the family to clear small patches near the hearth where the fire's heat could break down the waste. A slow, smelly process that was never truly finished. At times, the sheer number of animals caused tensions. Marlowe, the pig, would sometimes snort and shove his way into the firelight, competing with the family for warmth. The goats, skittish and stubborn, often knocked over a cooking pot or scattered grain bags in their restless search for food. And the sheep, their wool thick and matted, brought in ticks and fleas, which would swarm over the family despite their best efforts to chase the pests away. But this was life in Bramblewood, a delicate balance of discomfort and necessity. The Fenwicks had no choice but to accept their animal roommates, for the cold would claim them without the shared body heat. Each day was a constant negotiation between survival and endurance, where the line between home and barn blurred into one. Inside the Fenwick cottage, the mingling of animals and humans created an ecosystem all its own, and none felt it more keenly than Eloin's youngest brother, Tom. His small feet never quite escaped the grime that settled deep into the earthen floor. The dirt was packed hard from years of footsteps, human, hoofed, and clawed alike. Yet it never stayed clean for long. Each morning, Eloin's mother would sweep the floor with a rough broom made from twigs. But the dust and bits of hay would always return by midday. The constant traffic of livestock brought in mud and droppings from the barnyard, mixing with ashes from the hearth and grime from the family's daily labor. The smell was a constant reminder of their cramped, shared space, a world where comfort was sacrificed for warmth and safety. Tom often complained about the fleas, those tiny invaders that scuttled through their hair and clothes. The family tried to keep the animals as clean as possible, but hygiene was a constant battle lost before it even began. Skin itches were frequent, and sores often formed, becoming breeding grounds for infection in a time when even minor wounds could prove fatal. Despite these hardships, the dirt and chaos were familiar. To the Fenwicks, their earth floor was home, a foundation that connected them to the land and to the animals that sustained them. It was far from the grand stone castles of lords and ladies, but it held its own kind of life and resilience. At night, the family huddled close, human bodies intertwined with the soft warmth of woolly sheep and gentle nudges from the goats. The dirt floor beneath them was cold and hard, But it was the only ground they knew, and on it they clung fiercely to their fragile existence. As weeks turned into months, the Fenwick household's cramped quarters grew heavier with the scent of living so close to animals. The thick odor of hay, manure, and damp wool clung to every corner of the small cottage. Eloin's father, Bram, would often wrinkle his nose, though he understood it was the price to pay for survival during the biting winters. The animals necessary for milk, wool, and meat were both blessings and curses. Their bodies radiated warmth that seeped into the walls and floors, making the cold stone and earth bearable. Yet their presence meant endless struggles. Cleaning after them, avoiding the diseases they carried, and enduring the constant buzz of flies that laid eggs in the straw bedding. One grim morning, the family awoke to find that one of the goats had fallen ill. Its usual lively bleats were replaced by weak, pitiful sounds. Eloin's mother, Maries, tried to soothe the creature, wrapping it with blankets near the hearth. The loss of a single animal was more than just heartbreak. It threatened their very livelihood and survival through the cold months. At night, the animals stirred and shuffled, knocking over wooden buckets and scattering hay. Sleep was fragmented by the sounds of hooves on the floor and the occasional lowing or clucking. The Fenwicks learned to rest lightly, always alert to the needs of their livestock. Despite the hardships, this chaotic coexistence was woven deeply into their lives. The smells, the mess, the warmth, they were all threads in the fragile tapestry of survival, binding family and animals together in a harsh world where every day was a struggle to live. Winter's grip tightened over the Fenwick homestead. The snow lay thick on the thatched roof, and the biting cold seeped through every crack. Yet inside the crowded cottage, a strange kind of warmth persisted. It wasn't just the hearth's fire or the thick blankets. It was the body heat of every living thing packed into that small space. Eloin lay awake in the dim flicker of the hearthlight, surrounded by her siblings, parents, and the restless animals. The goat nestled beside her emitted a faint warmth that seeped into her chilled bones. The hen softly clucked near her feet, and the faint rustling of straw mixed with low grunts from the pigs. Despite the chaos, the smells, the occasional bites from fleas, the constant noise, this close proximity was a lifeline. Alone, the bitter winter could have meant death for the entire family. Together with their animals, they had a fighting chance. As dawn finally broke, Maries began the arduous morning routine, clearing out manure, gathering eggs, milking the goat. Bram prepared the animals for the day outside, feeding them scraps and fresh hay. Every movement was careful, calculated to preserve this fragile coexistence. In this cramped, stifling space, where humanity and livestock shared every breath, the Fenwicks endured. Their resilience was born from necessity, a testament to survival when warmth, comfort, and hope were so scarce. The lessons of living side by side with animals were harsh, but clear. In the Middle Ages, survival was a patchwork of hardship, cooperation, and stubborn endurance. The Fenwicks' story was but one among millions, a humble reminder of the sacrifices made for warmth and life. In the rugged village of Eldermore, nestled deep within the misty hills. The morning light crept slowly through the narrow cracks of weathered cottages. Among them, a small, humble home belonged to Winna, a peasant woman whose days were stitched tightly with the rhythm of the seasons and the weight of her layered garments. Winna stood before a cracked wooden mirror, adjusting the thick woolen shift that hugged her frame, the coarse fabric rough against her skin, but essential against the biting chill. Over the shift, she donned a heavy linen chemise, its edges frayed from years of wear. Each layer told a story. The patchwork of her mother's mending, the faded colors from countless washes, the uneven hems cut by tired hands. Her legs, bare beneath threadbare stockings, slipped into leather-bound strips that functioned as makeshift shoes. Footwear was a rare luxury. Many in Eldermore walked barefoot or with only rags wrapped tightly around their feet. Practicality reigned supreme. Warmth and protection were precious commodities in a world where cold crept deep into every bone. Her husband, Tom, emerged from the shadows, pulling on a thick wool cloak that bore the scent of smoke and earth. His tunic was coarse, patched at the elbows where the fabric had worn thin from hard labor in the fields. Like Winna, he layered himself meticulously, because each garment was a shield against the unforgiving elements and the hardship woven into their daily existence. Children stirred awake, piling out of their beds with uneven clothing, sometimes too large, sometimes handed down from older siblings. Layers overlapped haphazardly, a collage of necessity more than style. In Eldermore, fashion was irrelevant. Survival was sewn into every thread. As Winna stepped outside, the wind nipped at her exposed skin, but the weight of her many layers kept the worst at bay. Around her, the village stirred, smoke rising from chimneys, neighbors gathering worn cloaks tighter. The layered clothing was their armor, an onion of protection peeled back only when they finally rested, exhausted but alive. Winter had tightened its grip on Eldermore, wrapping the village in a biting frost that seeped through the cracks in every wall and floor. Winna moved carefully along the narrow lane, her body bundled under layers of homespun wool, rough linen, and coarse fur linings stolen from old pelts. Each garment added weight, but the chill was heavier still. Inside her small home, the hearth sputtered weakly, barely enough to chase away the damp cold. She glanced down at her children, who huddled beneath an uneven blanket, their little hands clutching at any scraps of warmth they could find. Their faces were pale, cheeks pinched by the merciless air. Tom returned from the fields, his boots caked with mud and frozen earth. His shoulders bore the hunched fatigue of a man who had wrestled with the soil through endless toil. He shrugged off his cloak, revealing a tunic patched with coarse thread. Winna handed him a thick woolen cap, knitted years ago by her mother, its stitches a testament to generations of struggle. The villagers moved slower now, their bodies burdened by thick layers that made every motion heavy but necessary. Simple tasks like gathering firewood or tending to animals demanded twice the effort. The layered clothing, once a mere protection, now felt like a cumbersome armor in a battle against nature itself. Yet, despite the hardship, there was an unspoken pride in their survival. Each patch on a garment told of resilience, each frayed edge whispered of endurance. The layers wrapped around them were more than fabric. They were shields in a world that demanded every ounce of strength. As night fell early, Winna tucked the children close, layering their beds with straw and old blankets. She lit a small candle, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the thick wool curtains. Outside, the wind howled like a wild beast, but inside, the layers of cloth and love held the cold at bay. As spring threatened to melt the icy grip of winter, the villagers of Eldermore faced a new challenge: the ragged state of their clothing. The layers that had once shielded them from the biting cold now bore the scars of months of relentless wear. Ripped sleeves were crudely mended with thick stitches, patches of different fabrics stitched on in irregular shapes, evidence of scarce resources and desperate repairs. Winna sat by the fading light, her nimble fingers weaving thread through the frayed hem of Tom's tunic. Each stitch was a story, a symbol of survival, love, and the harsh reality of their world. The coarse wool scratched her skin, but the thought of her family's well-being made every prick of the needle bearable. Shoes were a rare luxury, and many walked barefoot through the muddy lanes or slipped on thin leather moccasins that barely held together. Winna's own feet were blistered from the damp earth, but removing layers was impossible. The chill lingered like a shadow. Clothing was not just about warmth. It was about identity, status, and the invisible lines that separated the villagers from the wealthier townsfolk. The rough fabrics and multiple layers marked them clearly as peasants, laborers of the land bound to the rhythms of hardship and survival. Yet there was also a strange beauty in the way the fabrics told their story. Layered, worn, and patched like the very soil they tilled. Neighbors exchanged scraps of cloth and thread like precious gifts, their small barter system a lifeline in a world where new textiles were almost unheard of. Each layer added, each patch sewn, was a quiet act of rebellion against despair. The children played in their patched clothes, chasing through fields sprinkled with wildflowers, their laughter light against the heavy weight of their garments. For a moment, the layers seemed less a burden and more a comforting embrace from a world that rarely showed mercy. The sun had just begun to climb above the hills when Winna rose from her rough straw mattress. The multiple folds of her patched cloak rustling softly in the cold morning air. Each layer she pulled over her body felt like a shield, not just against the biting chill, but against the hardships she knew awaited her. Her husband, Tom, was already outside, harnessing the oxen for the day's plowing. Their eldest son, Bram, tugged at his worn tunic, his bare feet tracing the frozen earth as he followed after the animals. The children's clothing was scant, often nothing more than a couple of coarse layers patched together from hand-me-downs, but it was all they had. Winna wrapped a threadbare shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the dim light of dawn, the dew still clinging to the grass and the smell of damp earth rising from the fields. The layers of her clothing limited her movement, but granted a fragile comfort. She had learned to move carefully, each step deliberate, so as not to tear the fragile fabric any further. The villagers moved like ghosts through the morning mist. all wrapped in the same heavy layers, men in rough tunics, women in thick skirts and bodices, and children in whatever scraps their families could gather. The weight of their clothing was a constant reminder of the cold that never truly left, even in the warmth of midday sun. At the village center, the blacksmith's forge glowed faintly, the smell of smoke mingling with the earthy scents of the morning. The contrast between the warmth inside the forge and the chill outside was stark, a reminder of the rare comforts amidst the harshness of daily life. For Winna, each layer was also a symbol of her duty, care for her family, protection against the unforgiving world, and the quiet perseverance required to face another day. In a time when life was fragile and every moment uncertain, the clothes she wore were threads woven into the very fabric of survival. Winter tightened its grip on the village as frost glazed the bare branches and the ground hardened beneath a brittle crust of ice. Inside her small cottage, Winna sat beside the hearth, carefully mending a worn sleeve with needle and thread. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting long shadows over the patchwork of fabric strewn about, a mosaic of patched tunics, skirts, and cloaks, each telling a story of use and repair. Her hands moved with practiced ease, weaving new stitches through the coarse wool, cotton, and linen. These were the clothes that had shielded her family through many harsh seasons. Each patch was a testament to the resilience that defined their lives, a stubborn refusal to yield, even as the world outside threatened to break them. The children huddled close, wrapped in layered blankets and their threadbare clothes, their breaths forming little clouds in the cold air. Outside, the wind howled through the village, slipping through the gaps in the walls and roofs. But inside, the warmth of the fire and the closeness of kinship created a fragile sanctuary. Winna's thoughts drifted to the years past, how her mother had taught her to sew, how each stitch was an act of love and survival, how clothing was more than mere protection from the cold. It was the very fabric of their endurance. As the night deepened, she looked around at her family, the worn faces, the tired bodies layered in countless folds, and found strength in their shared struggle. The layers of cloth they wore were more than protection against the cold. They were woven with hope, determination, and the unyielding spirit of those who refused to be undone by the cruelty of their world. In the dim glow of the fire, amidst the patched garments and whispered prayers, Winna understood that the true warmth came not just from wool and linen, but from the bonds that held them together, wrapped tight like the layers they wore. In the bitter winter of the remote village of Eldhalo, nestled deep within dense forests and rocky hills, the people had learned harsh lessons from the unforgiving cold. Snow fell heavily, burying the thatched roofs and turning the mud paths into icy treacheries. The villagers, hardened by years of struggle, moved with purposeful haste, their breath steaming in the freezing air. Among them was Leora, a young woman known for her keen mind and unyielding spirit. She understood better than most why the villagers seemed strangely indifferent to cleanliness during the harsh months. Bathing was a rare and dreaded ritual, especially when the cold winds pierced skin and chilled bones to the marrow. Leora had heard the elders speak often of the sacred shield, a thick, grimy layer of dirt, sweat, and animal fats that clung stubbornly to the skin. This layer was no accident, but a vital armor against the bitter cold. It trapped heat and kept the cruel winds at bay, serving as a natural insulation far superior to the thin, tattered clothes many wore. To wash, especially in the icy winter, was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The sudden exposure of raw skin to the frigid air invited sickness. Fevers and chills followed those who dared to cleanse themselves too eagerly, making illness and death a real risk. The filth, ironically, was life-saving. Inside her small wooden home, Leora's mother carefully rubbed a mixture of tallow and soot onto their faces and hands. The smell was pungent, but it was a ritual passed down through generations, believed to bind the family in protection and strength. "We are the dirt of the earth," her mother whispered. "In this grime there is power, there is warmth." Outside, the village dogs roamed freely, their matted fur coated in mud and frost, blending perfectly with their owners. This shared layer of earthiness connected all living things in Eltalo, a testament to survival rather than neglect. As night fell, the village settled under a star-studded sky, the cold pressing against their homes like an unrelenting force. Yet inside those humble walls, the warmth generated by their holy dirt allowed life to persist, stubborn and unyielding, wrapped in a layer of grime that was far more sacred than anyone could imagine. With dawn's pale light filtering through the gaps in the wooden shutters, Eltalo's inhabitants stirred reluctantly, their bodies still wrapped in the warmth of the dirt that clung stubbornly to their skin. The morning ritual was unlike that of distant, more civilized places. Here, washing was a careful act of preservation, not purification. Leora helped her younger brother, Tomas, prepare for the day. His face was streaked with yesterday's grime, a protective film that his small fingers could not yet resist peeling away in the moments of childish curiosity. She scolded gently, pressing his hands back to his sides. "Don't wash, Tomas. The dirt keeps the cold away. It's our armor." In the marketplace, the mud-caked peasants moved like a slow river of earth-toned figures. Their rough homes leaked cold drafts, and few could afford thick clothing or sturdy shoes. The dirt on their bodies and clothes was not a mark of neglect, but a badge of survival. It trapped layers of heat, blocking biting winds and the harsh frost that crept into their bones. Some villagers applied animal fats, rendered from the butchery of livestock, onto exposed skin, mixing it with ashes and charcoal to create a paste that was as much a barrier as the thick woolen cloaks worn by the wealthy few. These mixtures had a pungent smell that clung to the air, marking Eltalo's streets with the scent of resilience. Leora's mother spoke of the holy dirt as if it were a sacred gift. "We carry the earth's strength on our skin," she would say. The dirt was layered like armor, each day adding a new shield, each night preserving the warmth that the fire could no longer provide alone. Washing was relegated to the rarest of occasions, festivals, funerals, or pilgrimages. when cleansing the body was required for spiritual reasons despite the danger. Even then, it was a careful, slow process, with the skin oiled afterward to replace the lost protection. As the sun rose higher, melting the frost but leaving the mud thick and clinging, the villagers set to their work, their dirt-laden forms blending into the landscape. An unbreakable bond between human and earth, life and survival. When winter's grip tightened on the village of Eldhalo, the reality of survival pressed down like the heavy snow atop the thatched roofs. The frozen ground was unyielding, the nights longer, colder, and the wind, a cruel whisper through the cracks in every wall. Eldhalo's people, wrapped in their layers of grime and fat, huddled close to the hearth fires. Washing was an act almost forgotten, feared as a threat to their fragile warmth. The once muted stench of sweat, smoke, and dirt filled the air, an invisible shield against illness, they believed. Young Leora remembered the winter her little sister, Marin, fell ill. The village healer warned that bathing could strip the skin of its precious protective coating, leaving the weak vulnerable to the biting cold and hidden sickness. So they smeared layers of lard mixed with crushed herbs on the children's cheeks, faces, and hands. A greasy armor against frostbite and fever. Outside, the snow blanketed the world in silence, except for the occasional groan of wooden beams burdened by ice. Within the mud and thatch huts, the walls soaked with smoke from the central hearth, the dirt on skin hardened into a crust, a living shield forged by hardship. Despite the stench and the unwashed bodies, this grim practice was a lifeline. Those who dared to bathe recklessly often succumbed to chills, their bodies robbed of the insulating grime that was both dirt and defense. Eldhalo's elders told tales of harsh winters when entire families perished because the protective layers were lost in desperate attempts to cleanse themselves. It was a cruel paradox. Filth was their salvation. The villagers learned to respect the holy dirt, a bond with the earth and with their own bodies, a testament to endurance amid the biting cold and cruel fate. As spring's fragile breath began to thaw the frozen earth of Eldhalo, a subtle tension gripped the village. The snowmelt brought with it not only muddy fields and swollen rivers, but also the season's most dreaded challenge, the urge to wash away the winter's grime. For many villagers, the filth they carried was more than mere dirt. It was a protective cloak woven from months of harsh survival. But the increasing warmth teased a desire for renewal, a cleansing that whispered of health and new beginnings. Old Tomas, the village elder, stood firm against this temptation. His face, crusted in layers of soot and oil, was a living testament to the power of the holy dirt. He gathered the villagers in the smoky hall by the hearth and recounted the age-old warnings. Water is no friend when the earth is still cold, and the breath of the wind can chill the flesh unseen. The filth on our skin is a shield against death's icy grasp. Young Elena, whose skin had never seen a bath, was torn between reverence for tradition and the whispers of the traveling healer, who had passed through Eldhalo months before, promising relief through cleansing. The village women prepared herbal poultices and layered ointments to protect their families, reinforcing the grime's barrier. children were taught songs that reminded them, "Dirt is life, clean is death." Yet despite the caution, some succumbed to the urge, slipping into the cold streams as the snow retreated. One by one, they returned shivering, their bodies vulnerable and weak. Fever followed like a shadow, reminding all why the dirt was not just filth, but survival. In this delicate balance between nature's call and human instinct, Eldhalo held onto its grim secret, that sometimes the dirtiest skin meant the warmest heart and the longest breath. As the seasons cycled endlessly over Eldhalo, the villagers came to embrace their dirt-covered existence not just as a necessity, but as a rite of passage, a sacred layer binding them to the earth and to one another. The grime was a testament to resilience, a mark of belonging in a harsh world where survival was never guaranteed. Myra, a young mother, watched her children grow beneath layers of soot and mud. She understood that their filth was more than skin deep. It was a living armor, an unspoken shield against the merciless chill and the invisible poisons that lurked in the cold. Each day, as the hearth smoke curled upward, she would teach her little ones the old songs of the dirt that held warmth, of the oils that sealed them from the biting winds, and of the wisdom passed down by countless generations. Visitors from distant towns, with their clean faces and fragrant cloaks, often recoiled in disgust at Eldhalo's earthy inhabitants. But the villagers knew better. The dirt was their fortress. Those who bathed in heated waters and wore silk might fall ill when the frost returned. The unwashed, coated in the earth's embrace, endured. When winter's grasp tightened again, Eldhalo remained steadfast, wrapped in its sacred layers. Dirt was not a blemish to be erased, but a blessing to be worn proudly. For in the grime lay the story of life, of hardship and hope, of death narrowly avoided, and of a community bound by a shared struggle. The filth was not merely dirt. It was survival, identity, and above all, a promise of tomorrow. In the windswept village of Greymore, nestled among dense pine forests and foggy hills, the nightfall brought little comfort to its weary inhabitants. Unlike the lords in their stone castles with feather-stuffed mattresses and soft linens, the villagers' beds were humble, sometimes nothing more than rough-hewn wooden frames crammed into the corner of their tiny huts, or just heaps of straw laid directly on the cold, uneven earth. Elena, a young seamstress, longed for the luxury of a proper bed, but the reality was stark. After a long day spent tending to the fields and mending worn garments, she returned to her cramped home, where the thin layer of straw offered minimal cushioning against the hard floor. The cold crept in through the gaps in the walls and beneath the flimsy roof, and the thin blankets barely staved off the chill. Sleeping was a precarious affair. The straw beds, though cheap and easy to replace, were a magnet for countless pests. Bed bugs and fleas thrived in the warmth of the night, feasting on the villagers and leaving them with relentless itching and sleepless nights. The cycle was endless. Fresh straw was brought in only when the old, infested bedding was burnt or discarded, but the pests always returned. Even the wooden beds were not free of trouble. Many were rickety and unstable, splintering under the weight of the tired bodies they held. Sometimes, the sound of creaking wood and the occasional snap was the lullaby that rocked the village into uneasy slumber. At the heart of it all was a bitter acceptance. The people of Graymore knew that comfort was a luxury few could afford. Their beds were reminders of their hardship, humble and flawed, but they were theirs. And every night, as the village settled under a sky glittering with cold stars, they lay down on their straw and wooden frames, hoping for rest, dreaming of warmth, and enduring the persistent, creeping discomfort that was their nightly companion. As the days turned into weeks and the harsh winter crept closer, the plight of Graymore's villagers worsened. The biting cold seeped through the thin walls of their huts, and the straw bedding, once fresh and clean, quickly became a haven for unwelcome guests. The tiny bedbugs, invisible to the naked eye during the day, emerged after dusk in swarms, biting exposed skin with merciless persistence. Joran, a burly farmer and father of 5, often awoke in the dead of night scratching at his arms and neck, his skin marked by angry red welts. His wife, Maeve, had taken to beating the bedding every morning, trying desperately to reduce the insects' numbers. But it was a losing battle. The warmth of their bodies and the close proximity in the cramped huts created perfect breeding grounds. The villagers whispered about the curse of the straw, an ailment that brought restlessness, irritability, and sickness. Children frequently woke up crying, plagued by the relentless biting, while adults battled fatigue during the day from the constant lack of restful sleep. Hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. Washing was rare, and the cold water of the nearby river was a shock to the body, often worsening illness rather than curing it. This neglect, though born of necessity, compounded the infestation problem. Elena confided in her closest friend, Willa, about the sleepless nights and the maddening itch. "Sometimes I dream of a feather bed," she said quietly, eyes wide with longing. "But when I wake, I'm here in this hut, scratching at the bugs." Despite the suffering, there was a strange resilience among the villagers. Life pressed on, crops had to be tended, meals prepared, and the children clothed. The straw beds, with all their discomfort and filth, remained the center of nightly refuge, a bitter reminder of poverty, but also of survival. As the seasons shifted from the biting cold of winter to the reluctant warmth of early spring, the villagers of Graymore prepared for their annual ritual, the cleansing of their sleeping spaces. This was no mere chore, but a vital tradition, passed down through generations, to keep despair and disease at bay. Early one crisp morning, Elena and Maeve gathered bundles of fresh herbs, rosemary, lavender, and sage, from the forest's edge. These aromatic plants, believed to ward off evil spirits and harmful pests, were to be burned as smoke spread through the huts. The air soon thickened with fragrant tendrils, curling upwards and filling the cramped spaces with a scent that seemed to push back the grime and fatigue. Next came the beating and airing of the straw. Villagers carried their bedding outside, laying it on wooden racks or draping it over low fences. Hours passed under the watchful eye of the sun, while the breeze carried away dust, dirt, and unseen invaders. Children played nearby, their laughter a brief but joyful reprieve from the daily hardships. Joran, with a weathered face and tired eyes, took up the task with solemnity. "If we let the straw lie untouched," he said, "we invite sickness and misery." His words echoed the shared understanding that their survival depended on such small acts of care amid relentless adversity. By evening, fresh straw was brought in to replace what had been discarded or spoiled. The new bedding was coarse but clean, a fresh start for weary bodies. As night fell, families huddled close, the warmth of shared breath and bodies providing comfort against the chill. Yet, despite these rituals, the cycle of hardship continued. Fleas and bedbugs would return, dirt and grime would accumulate, and the struggle for rest remained a nightly battle. Still, the villagers found strength in their shared endurance, and these acts of renewal, small sparks of hope flickering amid the harshness of their world. Night in Greymore was never truly peaceful. As the last embers of the hearth flickered low and the villagers settled onto their straw-filled beds, another war quietly began. A battle against the relentless swarm of pests and discomforts that plagued their sleep. Elowen, a young mother, lay wide awake beside her restless infant, wincing as tiny bites burned her skin. The bedbugs and fleas were merciless. She carefully brushed a hand through the coarse straw, feeling the crawl of invisible enemies beneath the rough fibers. There was no escape. The insects thrived in the dark, hidden in the very place meant for rest. Men like Tomas grumbled in the corner, shifting uneasily as the itchiness gnawed at their tired limbs. The wooden frames, often splintered and unstable, creaked under their weight, forcing many to sleep directly on the straw piled on the cold, uneven floors. The chill seeped through even the thickest layers of cloth, while the ever-present stench of damp earth and animal hides mingled with sweat and smoke. Despite the discomfort, the beds were cherished. They were the only refuge after a day's grueling labor in the fields or the forest. The villagers learned to endure the bites and the cold, wrapping themselves tightly in threadbare blankets, using each other's body heat as a shield against the unforgiving night. At dawn, the ritual of awakening was marked by itching, scratching, and the groans of weary bodies. The cycle of misery would begin anew, a harsh reminder of life in a world where comfort was a fleeting luxury, and even sleep was a battlefield. With the first light creeping through the tiny cracks of the timber walls, the villagers of Greymore rose from their meager beds, faces marked by fatigue and skin red from bites. Yet, as dawn spilled its pale glow over the thatched roofs, a stubborn resilience filled the air. Each morning, the straw was raked, shaken, or replaced when possible. Though precious fresh straw was scarce, and often saved for the most vulnerable, women like Elowen carefully swept away remnants of the night's invaders, while men like Tomas inspected the wooden frames, tightening loose joints or propping up sagging boards with whatever scrap wood they could find. Though the beds were crude and uncomfortable, they were the heart of the home. Children learned early to accept the prickly straw and the itchy aftermath, knowing that these small sufferings were part of survival. Storytelling by the hearth, shared meals, and the laughter of village life brought moments of light to the otherwise harsh existence. Despite the hardships, the community thrived on unity and persistence. They knew that their lives were woven with threads of hardship, but also with strength, hope, and an unyielding will to endure another night, another dawn.